Today's topic is figures of speech. If you've got 5 minutes, I've got 5 tips to help you to use figures of speech to improve your writing. A figure of speech is a rhetorical device which is employed in the English language and in your writing to convey an idea in a more vivid, imaginative, and effective way. And don't we all want our writing to be more vivid and more imaginative and to have the effect that we want it to have? So figures of speech can really add to your writing, but you have to know how to use them. We often use them to evoke emotions, to create vivid imagery in our writing. And there are all kinds of figures of speech, but I've chosen 5 which I think are very useful for you, and also figures of speech that you might not be as familiar with. For example, I'm not going to talk about similes because you're probably very familiar with similes when you say that something is like something else. Common ones are things like as busy as a bee, as innocent as a lamb, as proud as a peacock, as blind as a bat, as cold as ice. Those are very common similes, cliched probably. You can probably find better ones to use in your writing, but you know what a simile is. But I'm going to talk about some figures of speech that are probably less common and less well known to you. So here's tip number 1. Use onomatopeia to bring sound to your writing. Now there's a word that you probably haven't heard since you were in junior high school, maybe before that. Onomatopeia, you learned about it, and it is when you use a word that evokes the sound that it refers to. That's all it is finding that exact right word that conveys the sound so someone who's reading your writing can hear it. For example, buzz, bang, splash, clatter, beep, cheep, coo, growl, gulp, hiss. Try using onomatopeia. Try finding some new ones. Tip number 2, deliberately use an oxymoron to try to create a new meaning or a new concept. Again, this is one you've probably heard of before, and you've probably used the word, that's an oxymoron. In other words, it can't possibly be what it is. But if you deliberately use an oxymoron, you can create a new concept. And so for you who might be thinking, what exactly is an oxymoron? You've heard of it, but you don't exactly know what it is. An oxymoron is combining 2 contrasting or contradictory words into one phrase to convey a specific meaning. Here's some examples. Jumbo shrimp, typical one. Pretty ugly, another one that people use often as an example of an oxymoron. Silent scream, alone together, amazingly awful. And how about one you've heard before, a deafening silence. All of them are oxymorons that create new concepts. Tip number 3, use metonymy to create new images, to add depth, or to bring more power to your writing. Now, metonymy is a concept that you probably know about, and I've always known about it, but I didn't know the word until recently, interestingly enough. So I thought, if I didn't know this word, but I've been using this, maybe there are other people out there who might find this interesting, to find out what metonymy is and how to use it, because it can be quite powerful. Here's a definition. Metonymy is a figure of speech in which one word is substituted for another word that it is closely associated with. What it means is that you'll use 1 or 2 words to mean something that's related to it but not exactly the same thing. For example, whenever someone says the White House issued a statement, they don't really mean that the House itself did. They mean the government or the President of the United States. So the use of the term White House there is actually an example of metonymy. I suppose the most famous use of metonymy is the phrase, the pen is mightier than the sword. And that's actually 2 metonymy uses in that one sentence. The pen, of course, refers to the written word, but you just say the pen and it stands in for the written word, is mightier than the sword, and the sword stands in for the concept of military force. So the pen is mightier than the sword is much more powerful than saying written words are much more powerful than military actions. So you can see how you could use it to add strength to your writing. Tip number 4, use a Cynic Do to emphasize the symbolic importance of a specific part of the whole, or to show familiarity between characters. Now, Cynic Do, is this one that you're familiar with? Again, a very less well-known figure of speech that can be extremely useful and powerful in your writing. Let's start with the definition of this one. A Cynic Do is a figure of speech in which a part is made to represent the whole, or vice versa. For example, you might say Toronto won by 6 runs. And you are, of course, referring to Toronto's baseball team, not the city itself. A common Cynic Do would be lend me a hand. And what you're really referring to is for someone to give you help, but the hand is representative of the larger concept of help by using the body. Maybe you need to use 2 hands, maybe you need to use your feet, but nevertheless you say, lend me a hand. The use of that phrase between 2 characters, for example, might indicate their familiarity with one another because they understand kind of the shorthand, if you like. An example in great literature, of course, is that in Hamlet, Shakespeare uses the term Denmark when he's referring to the King of Denmark. And of course, by doing that, he is emphasizing how the king himself embodies the whole of the nation. Now, some people consider Cynic Do to be a subcategory of Matomy, which we talked about in my last tip. Whether they are or not doesn't matter. What's important is that you understand what they are so that you can use them appropriately in your writing to bring strength to it. Tip number 5, use irony to bring depth, insight, and creativity to your writing. You're probably familiar with the concept of irony, but you may not have thought of using it and how you can use it to consciously bring depth to your writing. And in case you aren't familiar with it as a figure of speech, here's a definition. Irony is a figure of speech in which the intended meaning is opposite to the literal meaning of the words used. It's a contrast between expectation and reality. Now, irony can be problematic these days because sometimes people will use the term literally when they're speaking, when they actually mean something figurative. For example, I heard a young woman the other day say, "My jaw literally dropped to the floor." No, her jaw did not literally drop to the floor. I could tell by looking at her. From a figurative point of view, my jaw dropped to the floor is a figure of speech, so she was speaking figuratively. So the problem is that people have confused literal and figurative approaches to speaking. What you need to do as a writer is understand irony for what it really is and use it in a way that adds power and depth to your writing. There are a couple of different kinds of irony, and I'll give you a couple of examples of each of them. Dramatic irony is the first one, and it is where the writer lets the reader know something that the character does not. One of the best examples of this is in the end of Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare has told the story letting you in on the fact that Juliet has taken an elixir of some sort to put her into a state of suspended animation so that when Romeo finds her, actually when everyone finds her in the tomb, they will think she's dead. It's supposed to wear off, she's supposed to come back to life, and she's supposed to then live happily ever after with Romeo, but that's not what happens. Romeo is the only one who doesn't know that she is taken an elixir. He finds her, thinks she's dead, and immediately impales himself with his sword. And she wakes up, finds him dead, and we all know how the rest of that ends. That's dramatic irony. Comedic irony is when someone says something the opposite of what they mean for comedic effect. And this can sometimes be satirical and it can sometimes be sort of tongue-in-cheek, but nevertheless, it's comedic irony. Then there's situational irony, where the expected outcome is subverted. One of the best examples of this in literature is O. Henry's story, The Gift of the Magi. It's Christmas time and the couple cannot afford to buy each other gifts. So the young woman cuts off her hair, sells it, so she can buy a chain for her husband's prized watch. However, the husband, because he wants to buy a gift for his wife, sells his watch. And he uses his money to buy a comb for his wife's hair. Verbal irony is one type of irony as well. It's where the speaker says something that he or she means completely differently. For example, sarcasm is a very good example of verbal irony. And if you have a sarcastic character, then that character is likely to use verbal irony from time to time, or should. An example of this, a woman starts off her day by spilling her coffee on her white shirt. And she says, well, this is a great way to start the day. That's not exactly what she means. Verbal irony. I'm going to suggest to you that you reread your most recent piece of writing, the last few 5 to 10 pages that you've written. Have a look to see if there are any places where some of these figures of speech might have added some depth to your writing. Talk to you next time. Subscribe to Write, Fix, Repeat, and maybe I can help you improve your writing knowledge and skills. 5 tips at a time.